All right, welcome sociology. Today we are looking at stratification. Stratification is a system in which groups of people are divided into layers according to their relative power, property, and prestige. I always ask my students, if we're meeting in a traditional classroom environment, to give a show of hands of those students that went to a school that had school uniforms. And I asked the students to give me specifics about what the school uniform was. Were there prohibitions concerning jewelry or kind of shoes one had to wear? I also asked questions about the justification for this. Inevitably, students tell me standard issue khakis, any name brands removed in some schools, certain collar shirts tucked in, or perhaps some kind of plaid skirt for females. Shoe prohibitions would be sandals, slides, that kind of thing. And I asked students why this is the case. After some lengthy discussion, one account was every morning, on Monday morning, after 8 o'clock, there would be a line outside the principal's office, people removing the tags off of their newly purchased American Eagle khakis, whatever brand was in style at the time. And the justification for this usually is to ensure uniformity and to minimize bullying that oftentimes comes when some have nicer clothes than others. Inevitably, the follow-up question then is, assuming we can ensure uniformity, everybody's looking the same, how then do students display prestige? So if we say you have to wear the same khakis, the same collar shirt, but you can't wear fancy jewelry or tennis shoes, how then do people display prestige? It oftentimes includes accessories, watches, certain tennis shoes, name brand tennis shoes, new name brand tennis shoes. And let's not forget the car, the importance of the car, or even the cell phone if you have the latest phone. So I'll be interested in hearing your take on this. In your school, what items best displayed prestige, and was there some attempt to level the cultural playing field? When we look at stratification, this is simply varying degrees of power, property, and prestige. These three things. Power would be your parents' last name sometimes. The last name would carry with it a connotation of what the parent has. So if it's a prominent old money kind of family, property would be the house, the cars. Prestige meaning, do you come from a family that has a bit of clout in the community at large? When sociologists talk about this system of stratification, you look at slavery, caste system, and class system. So when we talk about global stratification, we're looking at stratification around the world, and slavery was an obvious form of stratification. Now, when I ask you what you think of in terms of slavery, most people bring to mind images of African Americans picking cotton in the fields in the South. Mississippi was the largest producer of cotton, really it was a world producer. Before the Civil War, Mississippi had more millionaires per capita than any other state in the Union and was extremely wealthy, but not all. In fact, a very small percentage of Mississippians owned slaves and owned a cotton plantation. It was really just a small percentage of the larger population, and there would have been many different Caucasian Mississippians. They, however, were there not as chattel. Chattel meaning people can be bought and sold like a commodity. So when you look at slavery globally, and specifically ancient slavery, there are three functions of slavery. So the idea that you could buy and sell a person like a commodity, and specifically that people from a certain race are automatically deemed property, that was a newer invention. So in the ancient world, slavery, you could say, had three functions. The three functions of slavery were crime. If you had stole someone's goat and you didn't repay this, then you would have to, in some societies, it varied, but you could say one example is to pay back the price of a goat times 4, so 4 goats for one stolen. But also crime. So you have crime, you steal a goat, you have to pay fourfold. But debt, if you had borrowed a goat because you had some females and you wanted to pair them for reproducing so you could build your flock, well then in that case, you would just be out one. You'd have to, male goat for male, right? So that's crime, and then debt, and then war. And if your nation went to war with another nation, and if you were the invading party and you happen to lose, then all bets are off. Then all of the spoils of war. So this would oftentimes, there was no federal penitentiary, so no federal criminal system. Right? There was no debt, there's no IRS, and there are no debt collectors. There was also no Geneva Convention, which stated how we could treat prisoners of war. So in these three events, all bets were off. If you were invaded and if you lost, then you easily could become a slave. So when we look at the caste system, the caste system was in India's main system of formal stratification until 1948. However, these caste systems are still in existence, and I'll get to the U.S. system of stratification slowly. But when you look at the caste system, there are 4 castes, right? Brahmin, priests and teachers. Then you had the ruler, soldier caste, then the merchant trader caste, then peasant laborer caste, and then the fourth is not really seen as a caste. They're not really seen as human. They're seen as untouchable, subhuman. And even today, if you were to go to India, if you go to the capital city of Delhi, there are slums where Dalits live. And the idea here is that if a Dalit's shadow brushes and touches you, so if you're walking down the street and a Dalit child crosses paths and their shadow cast touches yours, then you are polluted. If someone were to touch you, a Dalit were to touch you, you would become polluted. This is bad karma. And the idea is that you're born into this lowest caste because of bad things done in a previous life. And just so that you know that systems of stratification have consequences, I want to give you a picture here. And this is just one example of a slum in India. There are over 30,000 people that live in these slum tent villages. And that's just an estimate. But there are many different slums, as many as 4 in a city. Thousands of people will reside in these slums. What you see here, several things of note. Women tending to their children. An entire family would live in one of these makeshift huts. You can see there's a makeshift roof with tarp bricks holding the tarp in place. Now the children will gather and they will scatter and forage from the trash. In some restaurants that throw their trash out, children will gather chicken bones bring this to their mothers. The mothers will put these bones in a pot of water, thus creating some kind of chicken broth. The children are notoriously malnourished. They lack protein, therefore they become sick with certain, that they're undernourished, and therefore they have sicknesses and health problems that could easily be fixed with simple nutrition. To give you some sense of the occupation of most adults. So they literally spend their entire life foraging through the trash. To obtain some kind of cart, a bicycle and a cart would be really treasured, prized possessions. Here you have an example of one of these carts. Children grow in this setting. Here you have as a bicycle, a motorcycle helmet that's been retrieved. Perhaps something like this would have been sold. Children gather cans and recycle them for pennies. But to collect valuable items found through foraging would be in this cart. A bicycle like this would really serve an entire family, extended family living in one location. So individuals that I've known that have gone into these slums are actually even chastised. So for instance, individuals that I've known that are from the priestly educational law, so teachers, the Brahmin caste, who would convert from Hinduism to Christianity, will go into these slums and will do a variety of things, teach kids how to bathe. These kids are not getting baths not once a week, let alone once a day. They're not going to school, whereas quality education would cost as much as $100 a year. The family probably won't earn $100 a year. Teaching kids to brush their teeth, teaching kids to dress, to purchase a school uniform and books. These things are seen as unnecessary for untouchables. So to give students access to these really basic human rights really changes their entire social position. And when you look at the United States class system, we would say our boundaries are fluid. Someone born in poverty can actually become very wealthy through education, through going to school, doing well in school. However, our class system was marked by Jim Crow segregation until 1968. So if we're going to take a look at the class system that we have in the United States, Karl Marx said that social class is divided into the bourgeoisie, who control the means of production. So in his era, this would have been those who had control of steam engines used in powering factories. For Max Weber, however, the Marxian theory of socialism broke down once you got to capitalist societies, and definitely in industrial and post-industrial societies, because there are many people who advanced in society whose parents didn't own the factory. Weber, however, said that if you have levels of power, privilege, and prestige, so power, property, and prestige kind of all go together. If you look instead at wealth, the wealthiest 10% of adults worldwide own 85% of the Earth's wealth. The wealthiest 1% worldwide own 40% of the Earth's wealth. So Jeff Bezos being worth $90 billion. Bill Gates owning, being worth also 70 to 80 billion dollars. You take the wealthiest 400 Americans, These are those wealthier than $10 billion a year, $10 billion in wealth. You add all of that up, they're automatically, so how small is 1%, right? The Forbes 400, we have 300 million people in the US, so 3 million would be the top 10%. The wealthiest 300,000 would be the top 1%. Okay, and then the top 300 would be the super class. So the top 300 or 400 would be 1% of the 1%. The 1%ers or the 0.1 percenters are those who have billions, right? So between 10, 20, 50, and $90 billion. So to give you some perspective. Now, sociologists argue, the functionalist perspective has basically said that we need some kind of social stratification because different positions have to be filled. Positions are filled by people who are more important. So the most important positions are filled by the most important people. So according to this theory, doctors are more important, powerful politicians are more important, and that these more important positions filled by the most qualified people. So greater reward should be given. Now, professional athletes that make $30 to $40 million a year, they are, we would argue, they must be more important than teachers because they are rewarded more than teachers. So the criticism of Davis and Moore is that they argue that positions that are most rewarded are not the most important. Those who are rewarded the most, these positions are based on market value and not meritocracy. So Tuman critiqued this thesis: if stratification is functional, it should benefit everyone. Anu Mosca says that it's a pretty, I would say, controversial thesis to say that society needs organization, it needs leaders, therefore. But his third point, human nature is self-centered, that's a pretty powerful statement, pretty philosophical and even religious, to say that humanity is self-centered, therefore people in power will use their positions to seize greater rewards for themselves. So throughout the generations, those who have power have sought to control this, and now you're moving into conflict theorists, which have said that human nature is self-centered, and those who have want to keep this. This is controlled by those who have power are trying to control it. They do this by controlling the information. The elites manipulate the media by selectively releasing information and by withholding other pieces of information. They also do this by controlling ideas. The theory, the divine right of kings, is that because I am king, that shows that it is God's desire for me to be king. And then you have emperor worship. So Pharaoh was worshipped as God. We have Nero, the Roman emperor, worshipped as God. Other kings throughout history, different civilizations have been worshipped. Because I own this position, I own divine right. God's given it to me. And technologies that are developed can be used by the elites to keep masses in check. So different theories here of how globalization and global stratification has happened. But first, let's look at the three classifications of nations. Now, historically, these have been referred to as first world, second world, third world nations. First world nations are the most industrialized. By income, Luxembourg, Norway, Singapore. Now this is obviously dated 2011, but these nations are usually in the same place. The only thing that changes is the national income average. United States, average income 46,000's gone up to 56 to 60,000. But United States is usually in that top 5. What I want you to see is that the industrializing nations, Ireland, Spain, Greece, Portugal, you see about 20,000 to 30,000 under the top. And then the least industrialized nations, which is really the nations that were not affiliated with communism. So historically, the nations in blue affiliated with capitalism, green nations affiliated with communism, although the better indicator now is their rate of industrialization. Now, the least industrialized nations are the poorest nations in yellow. And what I want you to see is the amount of income per person per nation. So as we move to this chart, the vast majority of the poorest nations are on the continent of Africa, starting with Zimbabwe at $200 a year. These are primarily subsistence farmers, meaning they don't own the land that they're farming. They get seed from their harvested crops, they replant these, or they purchase seeds, but they really have to sell their proceeds and have just enough to live on. If you look at oil-rich nations, Qatar, Kuwait, UAE, United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Equatorial Ghana, Saudi Arabia, Oman, Iran, and Iraq. These are oil-rich nations which vary from $120,000 per person to $3,000 per person. But this gives you some sense of how varied annual income is around the world. And what is the reason why some nations have a higher national average? If you look at the colonialization that took place, there are different theories, but colonialism, countries that had industrialized first were able to conquer weaker nations. So they had firepower, they had weapons and cannons, they had access to rail. World system theory says that industrialization led to 4 groups of nations: core nations, semi-periphery, periphery, and external area. And the core nations, Great Britain, Spain, Portugal, had access to waterways. So they were right on the ocean. So they had navy, they had firearms. When colonizing an area, they could build rail, and so it led to natural resource acquisition. Now, the third theory, cultural poverty, says there's a way of life that perpetuated poverty from one generation to the next. So there was something about the culture which lent itself to not developing these technologies. So in the competitive world market, the idea of cultural poverty led to racism. It led to our society is more advanced, and sociology unknowingly played into this with Herbert Spencer and his theory of survival of the fittest, that certain societies had not evolved because they had not progressed, and they had not passed these innovations down from generation to generation. So industrialized nations had evolved, and the least industrialized nations had not evolved. That led to a kind of eugenics, a kind of scientific racism. And it also justified the extreme wealth of the industrialized nations. So neocolonialism takes place when the most industrialized nations sell least industrialized nations goods on credit. So this turns into debt. The way it looks like in our day, a more impoverished nation, they need an airport, they need highways, they need rail technology, or they need, in our day, a broadband and internet access, or even access to solar farms, solar energy, wind power, technologies to make this happen. So if a industrialized nation or a post-industrial nation sells this technology, we'll come in, we'll build you an airport, we will build rail, we'll build smart technologies, access to sustainable energy resources, but we'll do it on credit. And this keeps poor nations in debt. Multinational corporations are companies that operate across many national borders. Some say exploit least industrialized nations. So technology and global domination. The most industrialized nations invest huge sums into the latest technology, and this perpetuates the cycle. So I want to just leave you with some thoughts. If you grew up in America, you have access to infrastructure. If a earthquake happens in San Francisco that is 4 on the Richter scale, we see collapse of buildings and bridges. The death total is typically 40 or 50. If the same magnitude of earthquake happens in Haiti, we see a death total of 150,000. Their buildings are not made with reinforced concrete. Their highways and their hospital systems are not designed for rapid access to massive population, getting people out of areas. Same thing in China, in rural China, when a large earthquake happened, hundreds of thousands die. And this is largely because in the dense urban areas, the money is invested in this kind of infrastructure in China, but in the rural areas, the earthquakes led to mudslides and many died. So we don't look at the influence of the fact that we have building codes that require certain quality of building. I tell students, if you grew up in America, chances are you flushed your toilet with better quality water than what 2/3 of the world has. Because the basin of your toilet has water that has to meet code. So that whether it's tap water or the same quality of water is piped through to fill up the basin of your toilet to flush it. That's better quality water than what 2/3 of the world has. We have 7 billion people on the planet. You could think of 2/3 of them. So 4 billion people don't have access to the kind of water that you had. 4 billion people don't have access to the kind of healthcare you did. 4 billion people don't have access to the kind of education. A hospital can't turn you away if you show up to the emergency room by law, even if you don't have insurance. These kind of infrastructure, the fact that you get on an interstate and drive to top-notch hospitals for cancer treatments, these kind of technological advances that we have in America, many places in the world don't. So in this chapter, I've been saying for 10 years, I try to convince you that you're wealthy just because you live in this country. In the next chapter, however, when we compare social class within America, you'll feel really poor when we look at the difference between billionaires, millionaires, and average people. So I look forward to hearing what you have to say in your discussion board. All right, take care.